what if the most defining moment of your career isn't actually the viral launch?
Right.
Like, it's not the keynote speech or the project that wins you the big industry award. What if the most consequential decision you ever make is just an email you draft it to in the morning, and then you delete it and you replace it with a simple, no thank you.
And literally no one ever knows about it.
Exactly. Literally nobody. And today, we are doing a deep dive into the mechanics of that exact moment. We're looking at the invisible tension inside your creative and professional practice.
Because that is the moment where the actual architecture of your identity is tested.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And to examine this today, we're drawing from a very specific stack of sources.
Yeah, we've got some great material for this.
We do. We have a recently published sociological paper on ambient conformity in creative industries, plus this really fascinating archival study on the career trajectories of commercial architects, specifically architects who refused major compromises.
Right, the ones who push back.
Exactly. And finally, a compilation of essays on the philosophy of negative space in decision-making. So the overarching mission of synthesizing these texts today is to observe the strict, unromantic reality of what it actually means to hold a position.
I mean, we really need to establish the bridge from our last discussion here, too, because if you were with us for the previous deep dive, the core realization we extracted was that creating is inherently an act of power.
Yes, which changes everything.
It really does. Because you are exercising power just by putting something into the world, neutrality is, well, it's a mathematical impossibility. You just cannot inhabit a neutral space.
You're always tipping the scales in some direction.
Right. But that realization demands an immediate follow-up. Once you accept that you cannot be neutral, you're faced with this very quiet, very solitary mandate of deciding what you are actually willing to stand for.
And we must define our parameters ruthlessly here. I mean, modern culture has completely warped this concept of taking a stand.
Oh, completely.
Based on our source material, taking a stand has absolutely nothing to do with activism.
No.
It is not about public recognition. We are entirely discarding any discussion of, like, branding or strategy or leveraging some controversial stance for engagement.
No PR stunts here.
Exactly. The central thesis we are exploring is that a stand does not begin with an audience. It begins with an invisible limit drawn for yourself. And it's maintained with absolute consistency, even when, and honestly, perhaps especially when, no one is looking.
I want to focus on that phrase for a second, without an audience, because, addressing you, the listener, directly, that feels deeply unnatural in our current environment.
It goes against all our training.
It really does. We operate in this digital economy that essentially equates existence with visibility. If there are no metrics, no reach, no engagement, our baseline assumption is that the event just didn't happen.
Right. If you didn't post it, it didn't occur.
Exactly. So the idea of holding a firm position without extracting any external validation from it, I mean, it's completely counterintuitive to how we are currently trained to operate.
It is counterintuitive. But it's counterintuitive because we systematically conflate two entirely different mechanisms. We conflate making a statement with taking a stand.
Okay, break that down for us.
Yeah, so the sociological paper in our stack breaks this down brilliantly. Making a statement is a broadcast mechanism. Its primary function is to be perceived, consumed, and reacted to by a group.
It needs the crowd.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It fundamentally requires the presence of others to validate its existence. But taking a stand is completely different. It's a boundary condition. It is an internal limit that you simply refuse to cross. And its function remains totally intact whether you're in a crowded room or whether you're entirely alone.
The sources refer to this as existing in the negative space of a creator's work, which I find to be a profoundly useful framework.
It really is.
It shifts the focus away from what you are actively putting a spotlight on, and it forces us to look at what you are actively keeping off the stage. Like, what are you refusing to build?
Precisely. To understand a creator's integrity, you cannot just look at what they produce. You have to analyze their negative space. You have to look at what is not happening.
What's excluded?
Right. The architectural study we reviewed provides some excellent, very concrete examples of this. They found that a true stand often manifests as the commission that is quietly declined because the underlying premise of the building, say, displaced a local community in a way the architect found unacceptable.
But there's no press release for that refusal.
None at all. The firm doesn't put out a newsletter saying, look at how moral we are, we turned down this money.
Right, you don't get an industry award for the building you didn't design.
Yeah.
You just get a massive gap in your revenue.
Exactly, you just lose out. It's the same thing with the essays on decision-making. It's the narrative a documentary filmmaker declines to aestheticize
Yeah.
because, making it look cinematic would obscure its inherent ugliness. Or it's the specific phrasing a corporate manager just refuses to normalize in an internal memo. When you quietly turn down a lucrative contract because it crosses your internal line, the world does not applaud you. The immediate result is simply less capital and less visibility.
I was reading through the structural engineering notes in that architectural study, and it triggered a thought about how we actually view strength.
Oh, the rebar analogy.
Yeah, because we look at a skyscraper and we admire the glass facade and the steel columns. It looks invincible. But concrete itself is actually terrible at handling tension.
Right, it cracks under pressure.
Well, it's great under compression, right? Like it can hold a massive amount of weight pressing down on it. But if the earth shifts and the concrete has to stretch or bend even a little bit, it just snaps.
Ah, I see.
The only reason a modern skyscraper survives high winds or an earthquake is because buried deep inside that concrete is a lattice of steel rebar.
And the rebar provides the tensile strength. It absorbs all those pulling forces.
Exactly, and nobody walking past a high-rise stops to admire the rebar. It is entirely invisible, locked in the dark. But the absolute moment that building is subjected to immense environmental stress, that invisible internal line is the only thing dictating the survival of the structure.
It holds the whole thing together.
Right, and taking a stand is the exact mechanism of tensile strength. It doesn't need an audience to function. It just needs to remain unyielding under tension.
And that mechanism of tension, that brings us right to the environmental conditions creators actually operate in. If taking a stand is an internal act of consistency, we really have to examine why that rebar so frequently degrades over time.
Why do people compromise?
Exactly. And so sociological data points to a phenomenon the authors call ambient pressure.
I noticed the authors of that paper were very, very careful not to dramatize this.
Very careful.
Like, there is no cartoon villain in a boardroom demanding that you abandon your core principles. The reality is much more mundane, which honestly is what makes it so incredibly effective.
It is highly effective because the pressure to soften is rarely explicit, but it is constant. Professionals across all fields face this ambient friction every single day. The system subtly urges you to wait. It urges you to soften the edges of your argument.
Just round it out a little.
Exactly. To introduce ambiguity where there was clarity. The prevailing wisdom fed to you by algorithms, by corporate hierarchies, even by well-meaning peers, is to constantly avoid alienating potential supporters.
The language used to enforce this is so fascinating to me. In the corporate case studies we looked at, the pressure is almost always framed as professional maturity.
Yes, or being realistic.
Right. Clarity is suddenly framed as risky, and conviction is framed as impractical. It's always a colleague pulling you aside and saying, hey, maybe we just round off this corner so the pitch is a bit more digestible for the mass market.
And we have to analyze why the system actually does this. Fundamentally, this ambient pressure is just a risk mitigation strategy. It's employed by the surrounding environment to manage discomfort.
Right, because systems hate friction.
Exactly. Clarity and conviction inherently create discomfort in systems that are designed for mass appeal and frictionless transactions. Therefore, the system will constantly supply you with what appears to be highly rational, extremely sound advice to remain flexible.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I want to pause and challenge the premise of the source material here, or at least pressure test it a bit.
Sure.
If I am a young designer or a mid-level manager being told to remain flexible and open to feedback, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? We're supposed to evolve.
Of course.
Remaining ambiguous while you gather data is a completely valid strategy. So how does the paper differentiate between genuinely evolving your perspective and just, quietly diluting your work out of fear?
It's a crucial distinction. The authors address this directly by drawing a very rigid analytical distinction between conviction and stubbornness, and also between openness and avoidance. They argue that we frequently weaponize the concept of openness to camouflage our own avoidance. So a professional might claim they're remaining objective, exploring all sides, when in reality they're simply terrified of the economic or social consequences of planting a flag.
Wow. So it's the defense mechanism of feigned curiosity.
Exactly. It's feigned. Analytically speaking, conviction does not require you to possess absolute certainty. The demand for absolute certainty is honestly a paralyzing myth. Conviction simply requires commitment
Commitment to what exactly?
to a core set of boundaries. It means your practice is responsive to new information, yes, but it remains anchored by limits that you will not violate. Stubbornness, conversely, is an ego defense.
It's rigid.
Highly rigid. It's unresponsive and closed to new data. You don't need to have all the answers to possess conviction. You only need the ability to recognize what feels fundamentally false to you and the discipline to refuse to participate in it.
That distinction is so sharp. The idea that openness is a curiosity that might alter your methods, while dilution is a fear-driven retreat that alters your core. That leads directly into the consequences of this dynamic.
It does.
Because if you actually apply this, if you refuse to dilute your work when the ambient pressure demands it, there is a strict cost. And I really appreciate that none of the sources romanticize this part.
Oh, romanticizing the starving artist or the noble outcast. It's just a coping mechanism. It obscures the functional reality of consequence. The reality, as documented in the architectural and corporate case studies, is that standing for something generates immediate tangible friction.
The physical manifestations of that friction are brutally mundane, too. It doesn't look like a movie scene. It looks like an email thread that suddenly goes cold because you refuse to compromise on a project's core methodology.
Right, they just stop replying.
Exactly. It looks like being quietly excluded from the next round of funding. The short-term applause drops off. You lose the contract. Refusing to compromise does not end in some cinematic victory where the boardroom suddenly stands up and recognizes your profound integrity.
Nobody claps.
Right. It ends in a measurable subtraction of resources and opportunities.
But the core argument of this deep dive is that we must measure that visible, immediate cost against the invisible, long-term cost of avoidance, the cost of bending to that ambient pressure.
I started modeling this out while reviewing the texts, thinking about it kind of like reverse compound interest.
Oh, that's an interesting way to frame it.
Let's look at the financial math of a career. A tiny compromise today to stay agreeable, softening the language in a report or tweaking a design to be slightly more generic so it passes the committee review. In the moment, that seems mathematically costless.
It feels like the smart move.
In fact, it pays an immediate dividend, right? You secure the contract and you avoid the uncomfortable meeting.
The friction is temporarily resolved.
Exactly. You survived Tuesday. But you have to compound that micro-compromise over 10 years. If you shave off 1% of your conviction every week to maintain the peace, the damage isn't immediately visible. But you wake up a decade later, you survey your entire body of work, and you realize it stands for absolutely nothing.
It's just a monument to frictionless survival.
Yes. You maintained your marketability, sure, but you completely lost the architecture of your own identity.
And that is the true danger of avoidance. The damage is completely asymptomatic until it is catastrophic. It is a slow, insidious erosion of internal coherence. Your professional practice, which is really simply the aggregate of thousands of daily micro-decisions, it eventually reveals your true priorities.
It leaves a paper trail.
It does. If your priority was always the avoidance of friction, your output will reflect a profound structural emptiness.
And we need to be very clear with you, the listener, right now. This is not a moral judgment from us.
Not at all.
And it's not a moral judgment from the sources either. We are not dealing in right or wrong here. We are strictly observing cause and effect. The choice you face is just a cold, analytical equation.
Think about consequence.
Exactly. Which cost are you actually prepared to pay? Are you equipped to handle the external friction of holding the line, the closed doors, the lost revenue? Or are you prepared to pay the internal cost, that reverse compound interest that just quietly erodes your coherence?
Because if the external world reliably punishes the stand and rewards the softening, and if, as we established earlier, no one is actually watching these internal, invisible decisions anyway,
Yeah.
the inevitable question arises, why does the invisible stand matter at all?
Right. If I'm sitting in my home office on a Tuesday and I can either push back on a client and lose the gig, or I can just swallow the compromise, cash the check, and literally no one is the wiser, why on earth should I invite the friction?
The sources converge on a single, inescapable truth to answer that. And it's this. You live with your work longer than anyone else does.
Wow.
The audience, the client, the critic, the algorithm. They all have a highly transactional, fleeting relationship with your output. They consume the deliverable, they extract their 5 minutes of utility or entertainment from it, and they move on.
They swipe to the next thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you, the creator, You dwell permanently inside the architecture of the decisions you made to produce it.
That implies that every body of work eventually functions as a permanent record of alignment.
It acts as an archaeological dig of your own internal state over time. It documents what you chose to amplify, yes, but much more severely, it documents what you left unquestioned, what you tolerated, and what you compromised.
So the utility isn't about looking good to others?
No. The fundamental utility of taking a stand is not to convince a third party of your virtue. It's not a debate tactic. The utility is to define and protect your relationship with your own work. It is the absolute refusal to fragment yourself just for the convenience of others.
So, what does this all mean for us in practice? Because we spend a disproportionate amount of our energy obsessing over the audience's brief interaction with our work.
We obsess over the metrics.
Constantly. We look at the analytics, the conversion rates, that immediate feedback loop. And in doing so, we forget that we're the ones who actually have to live inside the house we built.
That's a perfect analogy.
Think about it. If you build a structure using compromised, substandard materials just to get it past the building inspector and get it sold quickly, the temporary buyer might never notice.
The paint looks fine.
Right, it looks great on Zillow. But if you are the one who has to sleep in that house for the next 20 years, you are the one who feels the draft in winter, you are the one who knows the foundation is fundamentally unsound.
And we must interject a point of clarity here regarding scale. Because coherence does not demand that every single piece of work you execute must declare some heavy, world-altering thesis.
Right, that would be exhausting.
It would be, and it's a misunderstanding of the concept. You do not need to embed a philosophical manifesto into every routine email or basic spreadsheet deliverable.
As per my last email, the nature of human existence is... No, nobody wants that.
Exactly. But the aggregate practice over a lifetime, that acts as a brutal mirror. The stand is the invisible thread, ensuring that when you look in that mirror 10 or 20 years down the line, the professional staring back at you is actually someone you recognize.
This brings us to how the source material reframes courage, which I found incredibly compelling.
It's a major paradigm shift.
Because if we move past the short-term friction and we look at the long-term reality of maintaining internal coherence, the definition of courage shifts completely. We aren't talking about the loud, cinematic version of courage anymore.
No, the text effectively strips all the heroism away from the concept. Courage is not volume. It is not standing on a barricade waving a flag.
It's much quieter.
Much quieter. Courage is redefined simply as consistency. It is the unglamorous, highly repetitive discipline of remaining answerable to your own internal standards when the external reward system is completely silent.
Which is, biologically speaking, a profound challenge. Humans are neurologically wired to seek the approval of the pack.
We are herd animals at our core.
Right. We rely on the external reward system. We want the dopamine hit of a closed deal, the validation of a peer group, just to confirm we are on the right path. So remaining answerable to your own internal metric when the pack is completely silent, or worse, when the pack is actively moving in the opposite direction, that requires a very specific, very solitary endurance.
It does. But the sociological texts reveal this fascinating paradox that occurs over a long enough timeline.
The ecosystem effect.
Exactly. By deliberately ignoring the short-term external reward system and rigidly holding that internal line, the creator eventually constructs a completely new, far more aligned external reality around themselves.
Okay, wait. Explain the actual mechanics of that. How does an invisible, purely internal refusal reshape the external physical environment of a career?
It operates through the network effects of refusal. Think of it structurally. Every time you decline a project that lacks coherence with your values, every time you refuse to normalize a false premise, you are aggressively filtering your environment.
You're creating friction.
Yes. You are introducing friction to misaligned nodes in your network. Over a decade, this internal coherence actively begins to dictate your future collaborations. It determines the accessible worlds and the specific opportunities that enter your orbit.
Because you've weeded out the bad ones.
Precisely. You have systematically starved the misaligned opportunities of your time, your energy, and your access. Integrity, observed over a long enough horizon, inevitably attracts its own ecosystem.
I really want you, the listener, to think about how empowering, yet completely sobering that mechanic is. You aren't taking a stand to wage war against your industry. You are taking a stand to carefully, meticulously select which parts of the world you eventually want to invite into your ecosystem.
You're setting the terms of engagement.
Exactly. You are curating your future reality entirely through the mechanism of refusal.
It clarifies the ground you are standing on. When your practice is defined by ambient softening, your ground remains muddy. It's constantly
Do you
shifting.
sink into it?
Right. You can adapt to any container, sure, but nothing of structural weight can ever be built upon you. When you hold the internal line, the ground hardens, and that firm ground becomes the required foundation for the ecosystem that follows.
So as we synthesize everything we've pulled from these sources today, the trajectory is incredibly clear. We started by divorcing the concept of taking a stand from visibility. We stripped away the need for an audience or a platform or a megaphone.
It's an internal boundary condition.
Yes. We located the stand entirely within the negative space, the quiet, invisible decisions of refusal. We observed the relentless ambient pressure to soften and the immense danger of confusing fear-driven avoidance with open-mindedness.
And we also documented the unromantic reality of the cost, the strict subtraction of short-term opportunities. But we balanced that against the devastating invisible cost of reverse compound interest, the slow asymptomatic erosion of your own internal coherence.
Because ultimately, you are the one who has to live inside the architecture of your decisions. Courage is just the quiet, relentless consistency that slowly starves misaligned opportunities and eventually builds an aligned ecosystem around you.
The observation from the text is simply this. If the realization of our last discussion was that you possess power by the very act of creating, the realization today is the quiet responsibility inherent in that power.
It's the follow-through.
Exactly. It is the mandate to decide what you are willing to stand for, independent of outcome, independent of applause, and independent of whether history deems you right or wrong. It is purely about remaining coherent.
I want to leave you with a scenario to consider quietly on your own. Imagine if an archivist were to step into your life right now and completely erase all your finished projects. They remove the successful launches, they delete the awards, they wipe the resume bullet points and all the things you proudly display on your website.
The visible successes are gone.
Gone. And imagine they were forced to construct a portrait of you based exclusively on the things you have quietly chosen to compromise on over the last 5 years.
The negative space.
Exactly. The smoothed edges, the silenced objections, the projects you accepted purely for the capital while quietly holding your nose. What kind of portrait would that negative space paint of your true priorities? Because at the end of the day, the question isn't whether anyone is listening to your stand, the question is whether you are still aligned.